Confess by Rob Halford, Part 1. Hi, welcome to Garage Geek. So in the course of doing a contest entry video for Ron Haggerty, I found out that Rob Halford has an autobiography called Confess. Ron Haggerty was giving it away. I didn't know about this book, and it's such an interesting topic that I checked if my library had it available for audiobook, and they did. So I started it this morning. It's 13 hours, and I was very enthralled in it. And I got through half of it. And now normally what I do is when I read a book, I just include them in my Friday night chats. But I was taking a lot of notes on this book, and I decided that it could be its own standalone episode, especially since I'm only 50% through the book, and I decided to stop because I already had so many notes. The biggest draw for this was, if you didn't already know, so Rob Halford is gay. He's the lead singer of one of the most important hard rock groups, Judas Priest. And when he came out, it was a big shock. I don't know all the details, like if he was forced out or if he came out on his own. And so I was very interested to read and hear about his experiences basically from his own mouth. And what's really interesting also about the audiobook is that he reads it. Rob Halford starts with his childhood, immediately moves into his emerging sexuality, abuse that he had. So he points out what kind of abuse children can fall a victim of, and it doesn't matter whether you're straight or you're gay. There are predators out there, and they are on the lookout for unsuspecting children, and especially at that time when these were taboo subjects, abusers more often than not got away with what they were doing since it was so taboo. He also mentions seeing the movie. I believe he talked about the movie about Quentin Crisp's life called The Naked Civil Servant. So this is the book by Quentin Crisp, and talks about how brave he was to be so flamboyant. And always, he would constantly get beat up and abused for the way that he looked, but he stood strong and firm, and he lived life the way he wanted to. And Rob commented on how brave Quentin Crisp was, especially for someone young who feels so closeted and can't find a way out of their situation. So the first half of the book goes through the albums, which I will show on screen, all the way up to Turbo. On Sin After Sin, which I believe is the second album, the first one was Rock-a-Rolla. Let me just say that I, of course, picked things that stuck out to me, but this book is a list of everything that he's gone through, the experiences, and I'm not going to really focus on the rock aspect of his career, like each album and what each album was like putting it out, and the hits and what was going on behind the scenes. Those things are interesting, and I certainly liked it, but they're not what particularly drew me to the book. After listening to it for 6.5 hours, I only have this 2 pages of notes. So there's going to be so many items that I do not talk about. This is a really good book so far, and if you're interested in Judas Priest as a band, you might want to read it just for that, and I won't be covering a lot of those issues. I am going to talk about the song Raw Deal, especially I think No Solution mentioned it. I'm pretty sure. Sorry if it was somebody else. But Raw Deal has some lyrics about denim and dudes and Fire Island. I listened to the song and I examined the lyrics, and while there are hints that it's there, it's not really obvious to me. But Rob Halford was talking about how for him it was like a coming out song. He was like, he doesn't understand how he got away with it, how nobody noticed it. In fact, he mentions this a couple times. He would write songs that he felt were just exposing himself, and he would be really, really scared about it. And then when it went unnoticed, he would be kind of shocked and depressed because on a certain level, he wanted to be exposed. So anyways, the song Raw Deal is basically about going into a gay bar and scoping it out. Rob Halford would talk about how it was really important for him to establish his own identity, but then on the other hand, he was so afraid because he could be the reason that the whole band would fail, right? So if the press or the fans found out about his sexuality, that would ruin the band at Judas Priest, and he didn't want to do that to the rest of the band. So this was a constant struggle for him. And he's going to go through addiction and depression, suicidal thoughts. He's going to go through this whole gambit because he can't be who he needs to be. Now, one thing I thought was really interesting is that he would often get together with a friend, and a gay friend, and they would listen to Barbra Streisand till late into the night. And so I thought, okay, that's so awesome. He mentioned having the Damron's guide, and I remember these guides. I actually had a couple. So before the internet, there was no way to know where to go when you were in a new city to find out the gay areas. So of course you could go find the seedier places, but if you didn't know where they were, if you didn't know which bars were gay, you could find the Damron's guide. And the thing that he would mention is that he would have the guide and he would go to some of these places, but then he would be too scared to go inside. And I remember that exact feeling when I was traveling with my Damron's guide. He talked a few times about how he was on Top of the Pops. He and his band had kind of like very stressful times with Top of the Pops, and I'm not going to go into that, but I am going to talk about one time when he had a run-in with Marie Osmond, which was pretty funny. So he was dressed all in his leather and his cap, and he had a whip, and Marie Osmond was on Top of the Pops with him, and she complained that she didn't want him to use the whip. Now, the funny thing is, rightly so, he said, hey, this American artist is going to tell a British television show and a British band what they can do in Britain. And he stormed right into her dressing room and he confronted her, and he was able to use the whip. She capitulated. So I think that's a pretty funny story. Now, I didn't know this, but I guess there was a controversy around the album Unleashed in the East, which was recorded. It's a live album recorded in Japan, but his vocals were shot. He had been touring so much. There's just so much that was going on, all the stress, staying up. He also is a victim of insomnia, that his vocals on those albums, on those tours, they didn't sound good. And so he went ahead and re-sang all the vocals, and they added to them, and fans were calling it Unleashed in the Studio. Now, he said he really had no idea that he was trying to cheat the fans, but he did not really want to put on an inferior product. It's really funny because Rob Halford is this, metal god, and he keeps talking about all these gay icons. Like, he was fortunate enough one time to meet Cher, and he was all tongue-tied because he was like, Cher, oh my God, she's like this gay icon. It's so funny. He would be like, hi Cher, hi, and like he couldn't talk to her, which is pretty funny. He also has a story which is really interesting about meeting Andy Warhol, and Andy Warhol was taking pictures of him, and so he goes and talks to him, and I guess Andy Warhol was super shy, and so Rob was getting so sick of his monosyllabic replies that he finally handcuffed himself to Andy Warhol because he had some handcuffs as part of his outfit. This actually got a rise out of Andy Warhol. He still replied in one syllables, but he felt that the tone of the syllables of the words were higher, so he felt that Andy Warhol actually enjoyed the interaction. What he didn't realize is that he was wearing a Tom of Finland t-shirt. This is another point where he wonders why he just wasn't forced out of the closet at that point. So I'm going to show Tom of Finland if you don't know him. Now, I can't show much Tom of Finland because it's very pornographic, but this is the complete comics of Tom of Finland. Now, Tom of Finland is an amazing artist, and he is a comic artist for basically gay porn. And like I said, I can't show more than this because every scene that he drew, almost every one of them is pornographic. But if you get away from the homoerotic imagery here, look at how good of an artist he was. That art style is so good. So if you've never checked out Tom of Finland, I suggest you check him out, but just beware because this is tame compared to what's in this book. Now, this is a Taschen version. Yeah, that's Taschen. This is readily available. I'm just saying buyer beware. He talked about touring a lot and, opening up with or being with other bands a lot. He was talking about how he knew Bon Scott months before his death, and, what a great guy. Not only he, but the rest of AC/DC were. He talks a lot about meeting various members of the rock community. In another sense, if you're interested in this book, you should read it just for that, because you're going to run into a lot of not only rock, but because later he becomes part of Live Aid, and he talks about meeting people in all kinds of genres of music. Chapter 9 had the best cover. It was called "Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory Holes." I hope I don't have to explain a glory hole, but I guess I'm going to have to. So Rob would frequent glory holes in the United States, because that was one way that many gay people could have sex. They would go to public toilets, and there would usually be a hole drilled in the wall, and then they would, I don't want to get any more graphic than that, but you can imagine. But that was a very common thing to do. And he talked about, he was so desperate too, and most gay people from this time, they understand this feeling. He was so desperate for human contact, and sex was often the only way that many gay men could get human contact. And so one time he was so desperate that after a show, he took a cab to a truck stop so that he could, find a glory hole. He also talks about how he saw Freddie Mercury in a gay bar in Greece. Talks about his reaction to John Lennon's death, how that really affected him. And also he talks about a theft of an item from a home that was formerly used as John Lennon studio, which Ringo Starr had bought. He fell in love with a man who later turned out to be straight, but the man was very friendly, and they became great friends, but it did lead to some conflict. But he fell in love with this guy, and his name was David. He also fell in love with Phoenix. Now, I've been to Arizona, and Arizona has its beauty. It can be stunningly beautiful. It's very different from a lot of the rest of the United States. It can be hauntingly beautiful there. He decided to buy property there. The lyrics to Jawbreaker, he talks about Jawbreaker, and the lyrics are pretty funny. So it's basically about this enormous cock that when it, okay, this is graphic, but when it comes so hard that it breaks your jaw. Those lyrics are hysterical. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I want to stay as far away from that cock as I can. There's no way. I mean, it might be nice to look at, but no. I do not want my jaw broken. At this point of the book, he's talking about drinking, which leads to drugs, which leads to very unsatisfactory hookups, leading to suicidal thoughts. Like, this is a person in pain who has no real way to express himself. He's torn because of his position in the metal community, but also wanting to live a satisfying and fulfilling life, full of love. He met like this young cowboy, and it was dangerous because this cowboy, he says right as he was coming, he was like, "Oh, I'm 16." That's crime. And so he hadn't realized it, but he met this guy and who looked older, and then he didn't know what to do because the guy passed out. And then when he woke up, Halford also went to sleep. The guy robbed him of all his money, his credit cards, and his cassette and boombox, all of his cassettes. Now, at this time, Rob was set aside by the band's managers because they knew what was going on, and they tiptoed around it, but they were impressing upon him of how much damage he could do and that he needed to rein in his activity. And of course, this would be very frustrating for someone who was already so in the closet, so scared of not wanting to rock the boat, but needing to express his individuality, his sexuality. And so having to sit through something like that, I'm sure would have been humiliating and degrading. Now, up to this point in the book, I have not heard any mention of AIDS, and this is really surprising to me because I know that would have been a huge fear for anybody involved in any kind of sexual activity at this time. So I'm wondering if this is going to come up later. But what does happen is he does catch a severe case of hepatitis, and he actually turned yellow, and they had to he had liver damage, and he had to change his diet and his way of living for 6 months. That was a serious concern. He also talks about his experience with the PMRC, which is this group led by Tipper Gore that was into not censoring, but putting stickers on possibly offensive material to warn buyers, especially parents, about what kind of content was on the album. And Judas Priest wrote, Rob Halford wrote a song called Eat Me Alive, which is about oral sex. And then later he's talking about how that came back to bite him because this song landed them on the Filthy 15 list. And so he was worried about that. He also talked about meeting Joan Baez at Live Aid, and I thought this was really funny because I think on the second or the third album, he does a cover of Diamonds and Rust. I'm actually familiar with that cover. I really like the song Diamonds and Rust by Joan Baez. And he thought that she was going to rip into him for ruining it. But she was like, no, my son absolutely loves that. And he thinks it's so cool that something I did got onto a heavy metal album. So that was kind of refreshing for him. He also talks about how he loves Madonna and how he was a big, she's a big gay icon. We're getting toward the end of this part of the book, the first half of the book. He finally meets somebody named Brad, and he confesses that he thinks that this is love. And so that's where I am at the halfway point of this book. Of course, I'm going to listen to the last half, and I will put out my thoughts about that half. Now, what I am going to finish this by talking about what I think of the book. The book is very engaging. He tells a story kind of as if he's talking to you, and so you kind of feel part of the story. It is just like a litany. It's what happens and what happens next and what happens next. But it's never boring. I've been thoroughly enjoying it. Like I said, I'm already 6.5 hours into it. I'm 50%, and I'm not bored at all. There's so much that is relatable because almost all of this happened in my lifetime, and everything that many of the things that he talks about, for example, it relates to me as a gay man, but also it relates to so many people who grew up in the 80s, because he's talking about all the people that he's met and places that he's traveled, political items. For example, one time he talks about handkerchief culture that was a part of gay culture. Now this happened before me, so I don't really know much about it. I've only heard about it, and that is, depending on what side you put a handkerchief, it would talk about what kind of positions you like, and then the colors of the handkerchief would talk about what type of sex you liked. It was like a coding signal used. And he also talked about how when people would go into stalls, they would, I didn't know this, actually this is new, because if I had the chance, I'd probably do it, but I've never taken part in a glory hole. And so he said that the person would go into the stall and would tap his foot 3 times, and then if the other person tapped his foot 3 times, they knew that it was okay to go ahead and proceed. And then at the end, one person would always wait for the other person to leave before exiting, so that it would remain anonymous. And he talked about this one time where I think he was in Texas. After they were done in the glory hole, he walked out and he was washing his hands, and the other one came out and was young. He was young. I guess he didn't understand the protocol. And it was a really young guy, totally dressed in like Judas Priest, like t-shirt and memorabilia. And he was just like shocked, like, oh my gosh, I just sucked off Rob Halford. Of course, there's these little vignettes throughout the book that are really interesting and entertaining, at least for me. Now, I know this content might be upsetting for some people, but it's honest, it's true. These are the things that happen in his life. And so far, I think this is an amazing book. It's very honest. It's very raw. He does, like I said, he talks about his addictions, his feelings, and I am really looking forward to listening to the second half of this book. All comments are highly appreciated. Please let me know what you think, and I want to thank you for your support.